Good day. My name is Ira Shader. I'm continuing my series of my spiritual autobiography of my life story. For those of you who've been watching, I started this series with experiences of January 1972, most remarkable experiences, and I'm going to begin, and then at the Mayor Baba Center, then I continued the next tape into my experience of my first pilgrimage to India. And today I'm going to continue from where that ended off. I was on a flight home to New York City when I ended that last tape, number 2, in this series so far. This is number 3. 2 things I want to point out that I didn't mention. On the flight home from India to my home in my parents' home in Queens, New York, first of all, it was a little bit earlier than I had said. I didn't stay till, I think I said March. No, I actually came back in like mid-January, so before Amatithi. And the other thing is that on the way back, I had to have a pamphlet from Pendle Hill, which is a wonderful Quaker community, intentional community school that began in 1930. I've been very interested in Quakerism over the years, and I had been attending Quaker meetings at that point at the old Quaker Meeting House in Flushing, Queens, which goes back to the 18th century. And I happened to take with me to India a pamphlet from Pendle Hill, in which people can take a sabbatical for a year from their life and live in community, different generations, different parts of the world. It's most wonderful. And then I read the pamphlet, which was talking about and telling that it was available if someone wants to apply for it. And I had a very strong intuition that this was the next step I should take in my life. That when I got back to America, I should apply to go to Pendle Hill. That was the next step Baba was showing me I should do. But I felt inadequate on a pervasive level, that somehow, no one would want me at Pendle Hill. I started very low self-esteem at that point in my life. In spite of all the wonderful things that happened to me in India, I still felt shitty about myself, and I felt that somehow Pendle Hill wouldn't want me, so I put it aside. But later on, the reason I'm bringing it up is that it figured very, very prominently in my life. I went twice as a student, once for a year in 1991 into 92, and then far more recently I went again in 2009. And both stays were absolutely pivotal in my life for different reasons, and I will talk about them when the time comes to talk about them. I just want to point that out, that I was given that kind of heads up by Mayor Baba. Pendle Hill, that's something important for you to be involved with. And anyway, so then I got back home, and as I mentioned, I was kind of footloose. And I wouldn't say I was fancy free by any means. I was always weighted and burdened by life, much more toward the sort of the miserable side than the happy side. Very unduly serious about life. I've been that way since I was a child, and very existentially bound up and burdened. And even though I felt much lighter in certain significant ways when I got back from India, I was still deeply burdened on some profound levels which I couldn't address. And there I was. I had my bachelor's degree, and I had my first pilgrimage over, and I wasn't sure what to do with my life. Now, about the same time, there was a wonderful institution that got started in New York City called the Open Center, which was remains one of the first of its kind, not the first, but one of the first of a major metropolitan city, of a major, they actually were able to rent a large 5-story building in Soho and start a multi-level, multi-tiered center for everything and every spiritual movement, every health movement, anything that was all pertinent to the emerging new paradigms of health and spirituality were included in it. And so it was a world. I don't know, I haven't kept up with it lately, what it's doing. They've moved uptown a little bit, but for many years they were one of the central places on the planet, not just America, on that planet, where people could come and best spiritual speakers alive at the time would come and give their presentation, the best healers, the best shamans, and some of them that weren't the best, but whatever. In other words, one could find something there that would appeal, unless you just weren't interested in any of the stuff. So I got involved with that quite strongly, going to all kinds of events, taking week-end seminars, and absolutely adoring it. So that was an important part of my educational process, was the Open Center. I must give it credit. It was a very, very important, and I know it was an important factor in the lives of countless thousands of people over the years. And I don't know if it's given its, it became a center like onto Esalen. Esalen was famous at the earlier period for like the major place where encounter groups were happening during the mid-60s and spiritual groups. And then Eureka got started there. A lot of things happened. But anyway, Esalen was one of those places I had hoped to go to, but never quite did, although I visited it once. But the Open Center was not quite as idyllic in that it wasn't a setting on top of a mountain by the ocean, but nonetheless it had as great a significance in so many people's lives as Esalen has. And Esalen continues to this day to doing something. So anyway, I was at the Open Center, and I met a man there. He gave a talk. He was a very innovative artist. I forget his last name, but he borrowed the first name of Hieronymus. And most of you probably have heard of Hieronymus Bosch, the famous medieval artist. Actually, it was a little earlier than that, with those incredible tableaus of people in hell and very, very fanciful, almost super, absolutely almost contemporaneous, even though they're centuries old, photographs of the tormented people who are in hell together and various other things. And he gave a talk at the Open Center. He had a long beard down to about here, and he was, I guess, about 20 years older than I was at the time. I hope he's still alive. I haven't been in touch with him in a number of years. And he started a thing called the Aquarian University of Baltimore. The acronym was OM University. Great name, OM University. And he in his talk, he talked about what he was doing, not just as an artist. He did some incredible tableaus of the future of America and the past of America. He's all about the mystical roots of America, very much like Manly Palmer Hall, who was another very important figure, who Mayor Baba said was on the fifth plane. And he was also very concerned about the destiny, the karmic destiny of America. And Manly Palmer Hall had talked about how for centuries the hierarchy had been planning that America would be the place of the new avatar, where the new Christ would be most experienced, and things of that type, and the emergence. So anyway, during the context of the talk, which I was very enthralled with, and I was enthralled with him personally, he seemed like a profoundly fascinating human being. I said, I would like to teach a class at your university. He said, well, what would you like to teach? He said, well, I would like to teach a class on Meher Baba. And Hieronymus knew about Meher Baba. He said, fine, no problem. He said, would you want to teach any other classes? Yes, I'd like to teach a class on the various spiritual masters who came from the East in the last, since Swami Vivekananda, and the various waves of masters and how those thought forms have entered into our society. And he said, that's great. I'd like you to come and teach those classes. So it didn't pay anything, but it offered a room and board. They had a communal home that they had, like a community where the people from the Aquarian University of Baltimore lived, and I was invited to come and stay there and teach. So there was the best offer I had. I didn't have any offers from any headhunters who were looking to recruit me as an a young CEO for anything or anything. I mean, I didn't imagine I was particularly economically viable, which I wasn't, anyway. So that was the best thing. So I got my best friend, Steve Tischler, who's still my best friend, and I didn't yet have a driver's license. So he drove me down to Baltimore, and we started living at the community, and I started teaching my classes on Meher Baba, and the other one on the infusion of different waves of spiritual masters. And I had a great time there. I spent a couple of months, and the classes went wonderfully. And we got to do great things like shoveling hippopotamus shit from the Baltimore Zoo for our organic gardens. It maybe doesn't sound that delightful, but it was fun. And we had excellent vegetarian meals that were grown from this manure that we gathered. And it was all very exciting. And I had maybe about a dozen people in my Meher Baba class, most of which seemed quite sincerely interested in Meher Baba. They were avid about him, and I was exciting to me. I wish I had done more in my life to become a college professor. I wish I had gone on for my PhD in philosophy or in something of that sort. If I had to do my life over again, I would probably choose to do that. I wish I had been able to have a career as a professor in university and have graduate students. But anyway, that didn't happen. But this was a taste of it, and I was utterly enthralled by the whole experience of teaching and sharing and being around other teachers, because we had teachers who were teaching all various kinds of things, including Hieronymus himself. He taught the occult history of America. And I went in and I took his class too. Fascinating. And during the context of my class, I think it might have been the 6th or 7th session, I started telling the people in my Meher Baba class about the founding of the Meher Baba Center in Myrtle Beach. And I got so into it. And I described it as such an absolutely exceptional place that I enthralled myself. And within a day or two, I started feeling a call from Meher Baba to leave what I was doing and go directly to the center in Myrtle Beach, and not to pass go or collect $200 or anything. Now, I didn't want to leave my term, in the middle, or actually it wasn't the middle, it was about 2/3 over. But I was a very strong call. Go to Myrtle Beach immediately. And I knew it wasn't coming from my imagination. It was coming from Meher Baba. Go immediately. So I felt that I had given over strongly what I could about Meher Baba, and they knew how to research it further, even though the internet wasn't available at that point. But I had told them the sources, the books, and I knew if they wanted to, some of them would follow me down to the center, at least to visit. And I really wasn't a choice. Baba ordered me to go. So I spoke to Hieronymus Bosch, and as you might expect, he was very open to the fact that I was getting direct order from my master, and I had to leave, pull up stakes. And the other class also, the majority of what I wanted to impart already was imparted. So even though I would have liked to have stayed longer, maybe spent a couple of years there, I don't know how much longer they lasted, but they did go on for a while. Then I left with my friend Steve, and on the way driving to the center, I wasn't driving, I was a passenger, Baba told me again, he said, you must go there and move there immediately. He didn't say go there to stay on the center for 2 weeks or a week. He said, this time you must rent an apartment and set up shop. I mean, in terms of, well, for me this was a big deal. had never lived as I mentioned in the earlier tape, I went to commuter college. I never lived in a dormitory. I never rented an apartment. I never shared an apartment. I'd never lived outside of my parents' home except traveling, like to India and other travels, ever. So there I was. I was still 23 years old, but I had never. This was a big deal. Barbara said, "You have to do this." So I had thought about living in Myrtle Beach prior, and I even attempted it earlier in 1972 with the help of my good friend Bob Brown. And we made an effort to I tried to share an apartment in North Myrtle Beach in Windy Hill, but somehow I was too psychologically immature yet to be able to imagine how I could live on my own. I was still kind of ontologically out to sea, and couldn't begin to understand what it'd be like. I was always afraid I'd be too intensely lonely. How could I manage socially? I mean, I was very inept on some basic things that people, not inept isn't the right word, but I just wasn't integrated in a way that was normative. So for me, in 1972, when I was a couple of years earlier, to think about living here, although I desperately wanted to, it didn't seem feasible. Although economically I could have done it. It was, for $60 a month, I could have had a share in someone's house. It was not a prohibitive thing financially. But anyway, I didn't understand who I was or what I was doing, as I've talked about in other tapes. But at this point, I wasn't given the option. Mayor Bob said, rent a place. It was very, very powerful. So when we got down to the Myrtle Beach area, I didn't even stop at the center. I immediately started looking to rent an apartment that very day we got there, before I even visited the center. Somehow or another, forget exactly how, someone told me about an apartment for rent in Crescent Beach. In those days, Myrtle Beach was still nothing like it is today. And this was a waterfront apartment in Crescent Beach. It was a 3-bedroom for, I don't know, it was minimal rent. It was about $200 a month for the entire apartment. And so I immediately threw my $200 down, plus the month security, because I felt this was to obey my master. It wasn't even a question whether I wanted to live there. I was ordered to live there. So I rented the upstairs apartment. Within a short while, George McEwen moved in with us for a while. He had just broken up with Adele. They were married for a while, and this was her one husband, briefly for a few years. And they had broken up, and he moved in with us. And that didn't last too long, but he was there for a little while. And then my sister Susan Shader and my other friend Steve Shames came down. We had planned that they would join us. They came down, and they also moved in the apartment. So, but it was large enough to accommodate us all. And we started a life there. Meanwhile, Robin Reeves, who is now Robin Oppenheimer, in her maiden form, she moved down there. She was our downstairs neighbor, and I knew Robin from the New York City Barber Group. She was 1 year younger than me. She was 17 when I was 18. And anyway, I started life in the community. Now, when I moved down to the Myrtle Beach community, Steve and I think, were about number 172 and 173, something like that. It was it was approaching 200, the number of residents in what was called originally the off-center community. In fact, it was still known as the off-center community. When I moved there, we were still willing to admit that we were all off-center. Later on, as I mentioned in the previous tape, Elizabeth got up one Saturday night in about 1975 and said, "I think it's time that we stop calling ourselves the off-center community, because it gives the wrong connotation. And from now on, we'll be known as the nearby community. And of course, her word was law. She was the effective pope of the whole community, and no one argued the point. Of course, most of us kept laughing about the fact that it was much more apt to refer to us as the off-center community, because most of us were profoundly off-center in more ways than one. But that's how we're now called, by the nicer term, the nearby community. So the off-center community, which it was at the time, had about under 170 people, I think it was, when we moved there. And we wound up living there till the beginning of '78. And by the time we left, there were about 200, maybe 210 people in the community. Today, it's about 500. So it has not been tremendous growth in the last 40 years. But it's starting to pick up a little bit. It has not been. But when I moved back here in 2005, it was roughly double when I left. It was about 400. Now it's getting up to about 500, 400. But let me get that. I'll talk about that later on. Anyway, in those days, the community here was very much more continuitous. We were a small enough group that everyone could be included in events, like the wonderful Ralph and Stella Hernandez, who unfortunately have left us. They would have almost every year Thanksgiving dinners, and everyone from the community would be invited. They didn't have to concern themselves, even though they didn't have a large home, it could accommodate whoever wanted to come, because Thanksgiving, many people are with their own family, so of course not everyone would come, but even half the community came, or even if 70 people came, they could accommodate that. That was no problem. To give an example. Something like that today can't happen unless someone has a huge mansion in Briarcliff or something where they can invite potentially 400 or 500 people. Not that everyone would come, but it's totally a different scale now. Things were much more intimate. There was a much more still that messianic frenzy I talked about in my last tape. People were still much more enthralled in a way they aren't today with Meher Baba and the excitement of where it's all going to go and the imminence of the new humanity and whatever manifestation will happen. It was close enough to the event of Baba's dropping his body that people still believed in the redemption of the planet connected to Meher Baba. Today, Baba people don't believe that anymore for the most part. They pretend they do, but it's all rationalization. They've given up on Meher Baba, and the world has given up on Meher Baba. This is my opinion. They'll say they're gradualists, but that's bullshit. There's no such thing as gradualists. I know my good friend Ken talked very well about it in his books about it, but the fact is, Baba said quite clearly in the final declaration, which was the major blueprint of what was to happen, that the events that he's talking about would be most sudden and would be felt and experienced by everyone simultaneously. So there's no way that can be interpreted in a real way as a gradual evolution of consciousness. In fact, people who do that basically don't believe in Meher Baba, as far as I'm concerned. They're just apologists, rationalists. They're pretending that they believe in Baba, but they've given up on him, as far as I believe. I know a lot of people don't agree with what I'm saying with this, and that's fine. They can make their own videos, and they do. But I don't think, now and again, I mentioned Kendra Crossan. She's a brilliant woman, and she's one of the few people in this community who holds by the same position. We had a group at my house that met for about over a year, maybe 2 years, talking about the manifestation and where it's going, and she was one of the main attenders. And she said, I feel it's the duty of every Meher Baba lover on the planet today to expect Meher Baba's silence breaking at every moment of every day, in spite of the fact that he's been gone all these years. And I agree 100% with Kendra. And we're just a small minority, those of us who feel that way, but I'm not the only one. That doesn't make it less of a minority viewpoint. It scarcely is held by anyone anymore. But that's a topic for a whole other discussion, because that's all deeply metaphysical. And I'm mostly talking biographically here. Autobiographical. Anyway, I enjoyed living on my own, although I wasn't on my own. I had the support of my sister Susan and my two friends, Steve Tischler and Steve Shames. And we saw ourselves as a kind of a prototype of the beginning of some kind of intentional spiritual community. I also had a very strong feeling about wanting to establish an intentional spiritual community for Meher Baba, which also has a long history. My good friends, Tom Riley, who's still living and part of this community now, and his former wife, who's unfortunately deceased, Yvonne, they wrote a letter to Meher Baba in 1966, I think it was, when Meher Baba asked each of his Western followers to send him a letter of some suggestion of a project they wished to do for him. Tom and Yvonne, who were living in Woodstock at the time, wrote a letter that they wanted to start an intentional spiritual community for Meher Baba, with cottage industries, with dairy goats, with chickens. They were quite specific. I've never seen the original letter. I don't know where it is now. I think Yvonne still had it when she died. I don't know where it's gone to. Maybe Tom has a copy. I'll have to ask him. But anyway, it was quite specific. And Meher Baba wrote back a letter saying he loved the idea, but they should cable it until they met him again. Now, it turned out that neither of them ever met him again. Is that right? Yes, right. Neither of them ever met him again because although Tom had met Baba at the East-West Gathering in '62, what we're talking about was a few years later, and neither of them ever had an occasion to meet Meher Baba physically again. In spite of that, they almost did it a couple of times, bought land, started intentional communities, and I was getting very close with them from Woodstock days on, and I also shared that passion of wanting to start an intentional spiritual community. So that was very much operative in my psyche at the time, that Steve and myself and the other Steve, my sister, would eventually buy a farm in Horry County and start a template where an intentional spiritual community on an agrarian basis could begin. And we almost did it. Anyway, after living there for about a year, we moved on to a farm. In 1976, we moved on to a 100-acre farm. Well, actually, before we moved on to the farm, I moved out to Long's, and on a regular suburban brick home, which had about 2 acres of land. And in the context of that, I started acquiring animals. I got my first chickens, and I visited a local dairy farm where they're very cruel to the little dairy calves. They raise them for veal, and they just to bait their hunger, they put Coke bottles in their mouths and feed them Coke, which gives no food value at all to the young calves. It just keeps them from bellowing all day as they're starving to death. And I felt utterly horrified at what I witnessed. So I quickly found out how much it would cost to buy one of these little calves. And I was told that I could get one for $90, which I could afford at the time. So I picked out a little calf, although I wish I could have taken them all. And I saved its life. And we took it in the back seat of our little Volkswagen Bug. And then when I got home, I kept it as a pet for the first week or two inside my library of my home because I didn't have a place for it. So it just shit and peed right inside fortunately, it had linoleum. I was able to clean it up. But the little baby calf, we fed it milk, and it became friendly. It lived, and eventually grew up to be a full-size Holstein cow. So I named it India because it had a beautiful blaze on his forehead of a map a white blaze on a black background that looks vaguely like the map of India. So I named the cow India. I was very happy. It was the first cow I ever owned, or even got to know intimately. I loved that cow. And then in the context of that, we went Conway one day, and I saw it was Loris, I think. I think it might have been Loris. No, it was Conway. They had a feedlot, and they had certain animals, and there was a jackass, a mammoth jackass. I don't mean someone who was an idiot. I mean an actual jackass. And they're very big. The mammoth jackasses get the size of a small horse. They're quite large. Many of you probably have never seen them. And this mammoth jackass looked like it was wearing Dutch shoes. Because it hadn't had its hoofs properly cared for probably years, and it could hardly walk. So I felt sorry for this lovely creature, and I was able to purchase it. And then I brought it to a farrier in Loris, who trimmed down those hooves. So I named her Puna, and because that was the name of what Poon used to be. Where my mom was born was Puna, and she was a wonderful animal. And I used to ride her to some degree without a saddle. She was big enough to sustain my weight, which was a little bit less then, but not so terribly much less. And anyway, but at that point we had moved to Andy Lesnick's father's farm. Andy Lesnick's father was a good businessman, an attorney, and he made an investment. He bought 100 acres out in Longs, not far out, with a lovely farmhouse, nothing lavish but livable, and a beautiful barn. And he bought it mainly as investment. Andy never wanted to live there, nor his brother. And Andy offered it to me to rent for $100 a month. Now, I didn't have the entire use of the land because the land was still being lent out to farmers to grow soybean and corn, but I had use of the barn and the house. It was a 3-bedroom, sprawling farmhouse, so I was delighted because this was as close as we came to starting to realize our dream of an intentional community, and that's where I got Puna, and I moved the cow there. We moved the cow from the suburban house to the farm. We got chickens, and we tried to get, and we got dairy goats. That was the first time I started getting dairy goats and milking them and making milk, and not making milk, but getting milk and making yogurt, and starting to experiment with making goat cheese. And it was absolutely, I was like in seventh heaven, because this is what I've been wanting to do for years. We even went somewhere and we got this big male goat that looked like a biblical ram, named Hans. He was a Saanen, for those of you who know about goat varieties. It's a pure white goat. They have the sweetest milk. And most of the time in America, they take the horns off goats. This guy had full rack of horns, like a biblical ram, and had to weigh at least, probably close to, at least maybe even 300 pounds. He was huge. And unfortunately, he was never able to breed with any of the females. I don't know what his problem was. He certainly tried, but he never produced any offspring. I don't know if he was sterile or impotent, but whatever it was, he was just a magnificent creature. And so we had a very odd assemblage of creatures on that farm. We had some dairy goats, we had Indian cow, we had Puna the jackass, and a bunch of chickens and a couple of ducks. Every once in a while, and they all day long, they would all travel as a group, a motley group of animals throughout the 100 acres. And at night, they'd come back to the barn on their own. And then I'd close the gates. And this became the pattern there. And every once in a while, I would get seized by the longing. I don't know, I'd jump up on a stump at the farm, and I tried to unite them. I said, "Animals of the world, unite!" I tried to see if I could get them to, I don't know what, it was mostly comical, but I used to try that on occasion. And then I went to the Mayor Baba Center just about every day. I was almost always there, and went to every program that was available, which wasn't much in those days. It was a Friday night program, there was a Saturday night program, and then there was music. Music was incredible in those days. Bob Brown was there, Jim Myers was there, Paul Hurley was there, all these great musicians, and others I'm not even mentioning. And people would meet at each other's homes, not necessarily the center. Throughout the week there'd be musicals going on, not necessarily every day, but quite frequently. As I said, it was a much smaller, more intimate, more contained community. There were cliques already, but not to the extent you have today, where you have basically in the Bible community today, you have groups that are almost entirely socially isolated from each other, like for example, there are places that have regular New Year's Eve parties and Christmas parties I will never get an invitation to, because I'm not seen as socially important enough for these people to ever invite me. But I'm not alone. There are also other rejects of their society that they will never invite. Like John Light John Light is a great friend of mine. And we hug each other and we love each other, but he would never dare invite me to one of his parties. He considers me social shit. And of course he would deny it, but I know that's why they see me. And they see others that way. But we didn't have that to that extent in those days because the structure didn't allow that to exist to that extent. It was starting to get that way when I left in '78, but it wasn't that way yet. And anyway, I really loved living here at the time and going to the center virtually as much all the time. And it was a wonderful deepening of my connection to Meher Baba. It just was utterly foundational. Those 3 years from 1975 to the beginning of '78 were profoundly foundational. It turned out that I wanted, I tried very much because what happened was that, what's his name, Andy Lesnick had a employee, he also has a Shariah Press, he wanted to allow to stay in my farmhouse that he rented us. So he basically kicked us out. It was not fair. But we had no place for all our farm animals. So I made a desperate attempt to buy a farm. We found a beautiful place in Ash, North Carolina, with 30 acres. Anyway, somehow I wasn't able to purchase it. I wound up having to give my cow away with promises that it wouldn't be eaten. I had to give my jackass away, and these certain of my farm animals, my dogs and things. I had no choice. It was profoundly depressing to me. I went through a deep depression that lasted a few years, to some extent. I mean, I was utterly dispirited by having. I thought I'd spend the rest of my life here, and I wound up having to leave under very unhappy circumstances in the beginning of '78. And so I'm not going to go further than that. And there's more things I want to talk about in terms of the years living here, because I don't want to get ahead of myself. But I'm going to save some of it for the next tape, because there's certain things that happened to me in 1976 that were most, from a spiritual perspective, most unusual. I think I've had about 5, over the course of my life, as far as I can recall, 5 utterly profound spiritual experiences. I had the one as a child at the age of 5 where Baba spoke to me when I was coming home from Brooklyn, which I did as the first tape with Robin on August 25th. It's available as an almost 12-minute tape with her collection. Then I have the 2 I spoke about in January. Then I have the one that happened in 1976, which I'm not going to even get into today, but the next tape I will focus almost entirely on that experience. Then I had one much more recently in 2009 at my second stay at Pendle Hill. Now I'd say those 5 have been the most shaping, fundamental spiritual experiences of my entire life. The one one as a child, the one more recently, and the other 3, and certainly the one I had in '76. So just, I never even articulated that to myself until this morning when I thought about, that there basically have been 5 that are utterly life-changing. Not just life-changing, but they became sort of the shibboleths of my beginning to unravel the mystery of my own existence. I mean, all of us have that. I mean, T.S. Eliot talks about trying to piece together the mystery of one's existence. It's just that most of us are not that self-inquirers to really, especially after people come to Meher Baba, they kind of drop all that seeking behavior and say that belongs to my seeking days. I'm now found. But I've never been one who feels that way. I feel that the path to God, even with a master, even with an avatar, is still inquiring and seeking. I don't think one ever gives that up, but I know a lot of people feel they do. And but that's just perhaps my style, my temperament. Certainly it is. But anyway, let me just think if there's any other elements and what else is of interest. Well, we started, the community started a food co-op in 1976 called, I think we were called Organic Energy Co-op. And there was a buyers club, and we actually got a building after a while. And that was another wonderful chance for the community to cooperate and to learn to do things together on a practical basis. Because a lot of that goes on now at the center. There's tremendous volunteerism, which was not there at all, hardly at all. When Elizabeth and Kitty were alive and Jane were alive, there was not this emphasis on volunteerism. Sure, people volunteered for certain things, but mostly everything was on such a small scale. The function of the center can't even be imagined or envisioned without the hundreds of volunteers that help keep it going on a daily basis, a weekly basis. But in those days, none of that was there. We had a handful of caretakers, and it all managed. It all continued. It all existed. I had a anthropological professor in college who had a wonderful concept called the concept of fit, F-I-T. Sounds unduly simplistic, but he said, it always stuck with me. He said, whatever culture he studied, or anyone studies, whether it's the Fiji Islanders or it's some Stone Age community in the heart of Brazil that's never even been discovered by white people, there is the fact that whatever it is fits for that particular members of that tribe or that civilization. That somehow or another, doesn't mean everyone's happy or everyone's blissful or everyone's but it means that somehow it fits. And that's how it is also, I think, for spiritual communities. That the center, as it was in the 1970s and 60s, and then later on, had a fit. But that fit was different for what it was then than what it is now. It's a different fit. It's a different age. It's a different century. We're talking about something that's almost 50 years ago. And anyway, Myrtle Beach, for those who are not familiar, was virtually nothing. North Myrtle Beach was so nothing that in the winter you could practically stand out in the middle of Highway 17 and not even get hit by a car. I'm exaggerating, but not by that much. And it was tremendously seasonal, tremendously much more seasonal than it is now. And we didn't have any major shopping centers. The first malls started to come in around that time, but it was just nothing of what it is now. And choices of restaurants were limited. We had a Pizza Hut that we went to once a week when they had their special thick and chewy night. Had a special. We went with our best friends, Ron Thurlow. Ron Thurlow had come here from New Orleans with his wife and another woman. Lynn was his wife's name, and Nancy was the other woman. Anyway, they were Ron, who's now grew up. He grew up in Maine in a very lower middle class society culture. Relatively uneducated, bright guy, and he worked as a cook, excellent cook. But he went back to school and got his PhD. He's still very active with Mayor Bobby. He lives out in Ojai. Lovely fellow. I haven't seen him in years, but I'm in communication with him. And it's amazing for a guy like that. Got his doctorate, and but we all would go out together as a group, the five of us plus Lynn's little daughter. And we'd go out to the Pizza Hut, and that would be a big part of the week. They all shared this thick and chewy pizza together, a couple of pies. So everything was just that much more insular. I'm trying to give you a flavor of the feeling, what we looked forward to. There was a couple of movie houses, but they really culturally, if you wanted to do something interesting, you had to go down to Charleston or up to Wilmington. In fact, pretty frequently we go up to Wrightsville Beach to get something a little bit more interesting than Myrtle Beach. Myrtle Beach was as boring as shit, pardon my use of the word. But it really, except for the Mayor Baba stuff, but I liked it better. It was very much a sleepy hamlet, and there were still people left who had gone through Hurricane Hazel in '54, and it was nothing like it is today. And of course, you can't get back what was. And I never intended ever to move back to Myrtle Beach. but I'll talk about that later. I thought I was finished. I would never move back here. But then Bob ordered me back in 2005, and that's part of the later story. But if I had a choice, I certainly would rather go back. Not just because there are wonderful people here like Elizabeth and Kitty and Jane and Bob Brown and of course my great love, Winterfeld, Fred Winterfeld, a great dear friend of mine, and Ella to a lesser extent, but also all these wonderful people who are gone. No, but I feel much more at home in a little town like Seacliff, Long Island. In fact, I may move back there someday. Myrtle Beach is not the big metropolis of the world, and I was born in New York City, but this place is much too busy for me. So I'm not all that happy here, and I've been living here now for 13 years, and I'm just beginning to adjust to it after 13 years. So give you an idea of how well I adjust. But anyway, all this stuff I know is of interest. It's not necessarily the most profound spiritual stuff of my life, but it's surrounding milieu to give an idea of what I was involved with. I mentioned on another tape that Elizabeth, only twice in my entire stay, the 3 years, and I was there just about every Friday and Saturday, did she ever get up to the stage unbidden. Once was, I already told you, was to announce that we were now to be known as a nearby community. And the other time, she said, Meher Baba told me directly that there are 3 individuals who came to the Western world who were not for their work and not for their living here and altering the spiritual climate of the 5th and 6th planes, that he himself as the avatar never would have been able to set foot in the West. She told that to the entire group. Subsequently, I spoke to her further about that. But that was said to the entire group in 1976 on a particular Saturday night. I don't remember what day it was. Why she said that, I have no idea, because there was nothing in the films that had anything to do with that. And no one was asking any question about it, but she felt prompted, obviously by her own inner prompting, her own internal prompting, to get up and say that. Now, to me, it hit me like a thunderbolt. I don't think the other people paid that much heed to it, because for me it was like it was like I was hit by lightning. I thought that's incredible. I never knew that, and I subsequently asked her for further elucidation, which I'll talk about later on. But the fact is, I knew someday that story had to be told, and a book about it had to be written, because what was being said there is absolutely thunderstriking. Meher Baba never would have been able to come to the Western world. He never would have set his precious feet on the center land or anywhere in America, in Europe, or Australia, had not been for Swami Vivekananda, Hazrat Inayat Khan, and Abdul Baha. Those are the 3 who Elizabeth said that Meher Baba told her directly. I mean, she didn't hear it from Nadine Tolstoy, who then relayed it to her. She said always when she told me that, and the first time when she got up on stage, I heard it directly from Meher Baba. She always specified directly from Meher Baba. And it turns out that I am now, as of about 5 years ago, writing that book myself. I was inwardly directed by Meher Baba to write that book. I'm making very slow progress, but I'm making some progress. And the book is to be entitled To Set Foot in the West, because that is the very part of the direct quote that Elizabeth said that Meher Baba told her. I never would have been able to set foot in the West. He didn't say I would never been able to come to the Western world. I'd never be able to travel in the Western world. I'd never be able to live for any length of time. He said it in a very picturesque way. I would never been able to set foot in the West. He didn't explain exactly why. He said the climate in the mental world was hostile to him. He could not, as the avatar, have come here. But that Swami Vivekananda, Hazrat Inayat Khan, and Abdul Baha actually altered the very climate, the very nature of the inner planes so that he was able to, 20 years after. Now that's a fascinating story, and I'll end it with that. And later on I'm going to talk more about that, and hopefully the book will come out and you'll be able to read about it. Thank you.